Airbnb reported earnings yesterday, and once again, shares are down after the results. They weren't actually terrible results. Revenue was about in line with expectations, same with earnings per share. But management talked a lot about what their future growth potential is for the company, and that may take a few years to really kick in. CEO Brian Chesky sees multiple billion-dollar opportunities for the business. I think that long-term vision makes a lot of sense. But this is a case where investors are looking for what is the short-term results going to look like, revenue and earnings growth, versus what's the long-term potential. I think there's a ton of opportunity in this stock, but the reaction tells me that investors are really focusing on the short term. So let's dig into the numbers. My name is Travis Hoium. Thanks for watching Asymmetric Investing. Please subscribe here on YouTube for all my content. And thanks to this video sponsor, The Motley Fool. If you go to fool.com/ASYM, they'll give you their top 10 stocks to buy right now. So let's look first at the high-level results. And these came in largely ahead of expectations, at least the guidance that management had given. Revenue was up 10% from a year ago. Like I said, that's at the high end of what management was expecting, $3.7 billion. Net income, look at this net income margin, 37%. Just a phenomenal margin for any business, but this shows the power of a platform business like Airbnb. Adjusted EBITDA, $2 billion, and free cash flow, which is going to be volatile quarter to quarter and year to year. I look at more so the trailing 12-month numbers, $4.1 billion in trailing 12-month free cash flow. Where there seemed to be a little bit more momentum was in this bookings. Management talked a lot about this on the conference call, that bookings started to pick up towards the end of the quarter and then into the fourth quarter. Seems like there was a little bit of impact from the Olympics. People were just kind of putting off traveling when the Olympics was going on. France is a pretty big market for Airbnb, so makes sense. And then once the Olympics ended, kind of got back to normal traveling patterns. One of the reasons that I like Airbnb is the great balance sheet. I'll get to some of the balance sheet numbers in just a little bit, but they're starting to buy back stock at a pretty rapid clip. $1.1 billion of stock bought back in the third quarter alone. At the end of the quarter, 665 million shares outstanding. That includes stock-based compensation and warrants that are outstanding. They also still have $4.2 billion available in a share repurchase authorization and plenty of cash to make that happen, with $11.3 billion in cash for the company and then another $6.6 billion in cash held on behalf of guests. Remember, guests pay for their Airbnb stay before the actual stay happens, and then Airbnb doesn't release that money to the host until after the stay has ended. Fourth quarter revenue expecting to be $2.39 to $2.44 billion. That's up from $2.22 billion a year ago. So continuing to see right around that double-digit revenue growth number. I think that's really solid, especially if you can keep adjusted EBITDA margins of right around 35%. Those margins really high. That's what's going to keep generating that free cash flow. So you got an extremely solid core to build on top of. And it's what's coming next that ultimately gets me the most excited about Airbnb stock, because I think you got a really good business, really good core, pretty reasonable value, but then the long-term growth is where there's a lot of opportunity. So just from a value perspective, Airbnb market cap currently at about $93 billion. That's in the middle of trading on Friday, so after the recent stock drop. The enterprise value to sales on a forward basis is about 7. Price to earnings multiple is about 32.5, and the price to free cash flow, which is probably a better proxy for Airbnb, is about 21. So I think those are reasonable valuations, and those don't include the cash that's on the balance sheet. You can see that here, about $17.8 billion worth of cash on the balance sheet. The great thing about that cash is that Airbnb is generating now close to $1 billion a year in interest income, just on interest on the cash that sits on the balance sheet. So not only its own cash, like I said earlier, also the cash that's coming from customers. When that's on the balance sheet, they get to invest that in things like treasuries, savings accounts, generates a 4, 5, 6% return. That money is money that Airbnb gets to keep. So just another benefit of the business model that Airbnb has. But I think what we need to think about ultimately is, you have that foundation, you have that core, it's growing, maybe not all that exciting, but it's still a double-digit growth company, very, very profitable, very high cash flow. But what's ultimately the 10x opportunity? That is in what comes next for Airbnb. We at least got some glimpses into what they're building. You got to read between the lines, but I'm going to go through some of these comments from Brian Chesky. Thanks to our friends at The Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. Visit fool.com/ASYM for the top 10 stocks to buy right now. Now, one of the things that Airbnb has talked about for quite a while now is expanding beyond the core, adding new verticals, continuing this platform play, so they're not going to become a capital intensive company, but how do you add more products than just short-term rentals, even long-term rentals? So we got some hints into that. This was a comment from CEO Brian Chesky. He says, we're going to launch 1 to 2 new businesses that will generate $1 billion or more in revenue incrementally each year. That may take time to get to that $1 billion number, but he says, I'm not going to be able to share with you what those things are going to be, but does say that they're at least going to start adjacent to where Airbnb is today. So think about experiences, what they're doing with their Icons product. I think that's probably the first leg to fall. Are they going to get into things like air travel, like transportation? One of the things that came up later in the call was having a more regular interaction with Airbnb. So things to do around where you live, whether that's restaurants or experiences. This was related to a question from an analyst, and Chesky says, I think one of the many new offerings that can increase frequency and can make Airbnb from a annual app to more of like a monthly or weekly app is experiences. Goes on to talk about, could you use Airbnb to find a restaurant that you want to go to on a Friday night? So not just what are the experiences when you're out traveling, but also what are the experiences when you're at home? He has talked about becoming a concierge for people when they travel. But if you have this platform, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you're using once or twice a year. Could it be something that you're interacting with a little bit more often? Hey, I've got a family of 4 or family of 5. We want to go do something fun on Friday nights. Here's the age of our kids. What are my options? And if Airbnb can just find those options for you, saves a lot of searching around for entertainment options. So I think those are the kinds of things that we can probably expect for Airbnb in the future, adding on adjacent services in the app. What exactly those look like, what exactly the interaction looks like, we don't really know right now. But when you have as many users as Airbnb does, when you have that trust connection, you have information about what people want to do when they travel, I think you are able to expand into all kinds of new markets. I think travel would make a lot of sense. Transportation makes a lot of sense. Restaurants, experiences, all of these things are natural verticals for Airbnb to get into. Sounds like we'll learn a little bit more in their spring release. That's likely coming around May time in 2025. So it's still a little ways away. And this has been in the works for quite a while for Airbnb. Chesky started talking about the impact of artificial intelligence and how they could become a concierge a little over a year ago, I believe now. So maybe these things are going to actually start to come to fruition. But I think the optionality with Airbnb is just phenomenal. It doesn't mean that the stock can't pull back from here, but you do have a pretty good valuation for the stock. You have a core business that continues to grow at that low double-digit rate. That's a pretty solid growth rate, outgrowing the economy and spending overall. Also growing at least in line, if not a little bit better than a lot of their competitors. There's a lot of ways that Airbnb can grow that core business. And then if they add some of these adjacent businesses, whatever those look like in the future, that's going to be incremental revenue growth, incremental margin for the company. And so I think those are going to be ultimately positives. And if you pick up that growth from 10% to 20 or 25%, that's where you start to get a higher multiple as well. So I think there's a lot to like about Airbnb, but it is one of those stocks that I have a 10, 15-year horizon, not something I'm necessarily worried about the next quarter. That distinction is something that I think the market is focusing on right now, is what does the quarter look like? And there wasn't a lot to write home about this quarter. That seems like that's why the stock is down. But hopefully that context was helpful. What do you think about Airbnb and its potential 5, 10 years from now to get into more and more businesses? Let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to subscribe to Asymmetric Investing. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you here next time.